The sea was still that morning, as if holding its breath. Dawn crept slowly over the Bismarck Sea, laying a thin mist over the horizon, where 8 Japanese destroyers and 8 transport ships sliced the water with steady precision. On the bridge of the destroyer Arashio, Captain Commander Hideo Koboki stood motionless, his eyes scanning the grey line where the ocean met the sky. He had seen war before, nights filled with fire and steel, but this morning felt different, eerily calm, as though something was watching. Below, the deck buzzed with frantic energy. Sailors moved with urgency, pulling survivors from the oil-slicked waters. They were men from the Kyokus Maru, sunk the day before by an American B-17 attack. They were wet, shaken, and silent. The convoy, part of the desperate Operation 81, was carrying nearly 7,000 troops meant to reinforce the crucial Japanese positions in Lae, New Guinea. The mission was dangerous but essential. Everyone aboard knew the stakes, yet despite the losses, Koboki believed they would make it. They were close now, hours from land. With fighter cover promised from Lae, confidence had returned. That illusion shattered at precisely 10 a.m. A lookout's cry pierced the humid air. Aircraft! Koboki jerked his binoculars to the southwest. What he saw chilled him. It wasn't the high-flying B-17s he expected, gliding far above the clouds. These were something else. American B-25 Mitchell bombers and Australian Bristol Beaufighters screaming toward the sea surface. Low, impossibly low, their propellers churned sea spray. And they weren't coming to bomb from above. They were skimming the surface in a new kind of attack, something Koboki had never witnessed in all his years. He shouted orders, but it was already too late. The first wave of Beaufighters opened fire with their 20mm cannons and machine guns, strafing Arashio's deck with blistering precision. Gun crews collapsed under a hail of fire. The bridge windows exploded inward, slicing signalmen to the floor. Before Koboki could steady himself, the B-25s came roaring in, skip bombing. Their payloads bounced off the water like skipping stones, fuses timed to detonate just as they struck the hulls. A thunderous boom threw Arashio into chaos. Koboki's knees buckled. The destroyer shuddered, its steering obliterated. Out of control, it veered hard to port, straight into the side of the transport Nojima Maru. The two ships collided, steel grinding against steel, their fates sealed in that instant. Within 15 minutes, everything unraveled. 7 of the 8 Japanese transports were hit, some burned, others sank within minutes. 4 destroyers were either sunk or crippled. Men spilled into the water, screaming, clinging to debris. A convoy that had taken months to assemble, trained soldiers, critical supplies, commanding officers, was being erased in a matter of moments. And it wasn't over. This wasn't just another raid. It was the unveiling of a new weapon, a new idea. Skip bombing, developed in secret by Allied tacticians, had just proven what many feared. Surface ships were no longer safe within reach of land-based aircraft. The rules had changed, and for men like Koboki, caught between history and innovation, there was no warning, no precedent, only destruction. The sea, once calm and silent, now boiled with oil, fire, and blood, and it was only the beginning. 2 months before the convoy's fiery end, in January 1943, a very different storm was brewing in the island fortress of Rabaul. From within the dimly lit chambers of the 8th Area Army Headquarters, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura studied a map of the South Pacific with furrowed brows. Reports from the New Guinea front were grim. Buna had fallen to the Allies, and now the Australian and American forces were pressing toward the critical coastal cities of Lae and Salamaua. If Lae were to fall, Rabaul itself, Japan's major military hub in the Pacific, would be exposed. This was not just a military dilemma, it was a strategic nightmare. Every Japanese soldier, rifle, and sack of rice needed to travel over 500 treacherous miles of sea to reach the front. Allied air power was growing stronger by the day. Each shipment was a gamble, and the cost of failure was becoming intolerable. Imamura had already seen one convoy ravaged, casualties piling up, medical supplies lost at sea, morale plummeting. He needed a decisive action. Reinforcements were not a luxury, they were a necessity. After intense debate with his staff, Imamura ordered the largest Japanese reinforcement mission to date, Operation 81. The goal was simple in theory: move 6,900 men of the 51st Division, along with their supplies, to lie in a single bold operation. It would be a gamble, but the alternative, losing New Guinea entirely, was unthinkable. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura was chosen to lead the mission. At 54, Kimura was a seasoned veteran, respected for his naval prowess and leadership in the brutal Solomon Islands campaigns. His destroyers, 8 in total, were combat-tested and deadly, bearing names that struck fear into Allied sailors: Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Shikinami, Uranami, and Asagumo. But this operation would test them in ways they hadn't imagined. Unlike the high-speed night runs of the Tokyo Express, this convoy would be shackled by the slow transport ships it protected. The fleet's speed would be throttled to a paltry 7 knots, barely faster than a man running. It made Kimura uneasy. Every mile traveled in daylight would be an invitation to attack. Still, duty demanded resolve. Meanwhile, across the Bismarck Sea in Port Moresby, Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, commander of the U.S. 5th Air Force, was facing his own war. For months, his bombers had been hammering Japanese convoys with little success. High-altitude bombing against fast-moving ships was ineffective. Bombs missed more often than not, and the Japanese kept reinforcing their coastal positions. MacArthur needed results. Kenney needed a breakthrough. Kenney, a known maverick with a disdain for conventional doctrine, recalled an old theory he'd championed in 1928: skip bombing. Ridiculed at the time, the idea was to drop bombs from low altitude so they would bounce across the water and detonate against ship hulls. Now, with the war at his doorstep, he dusted off the theory and put it to the test. He had an ace up his sleeve: Major Paul Pappy Gunn. A civilian pilot turned military genius, Gunn was as eccentric as he was brilliant. When his family was captured by the Japanese in Manila, his desire for revenge became personal. He stripped standard B-25 bombers of their bomb sights and added forward-facing 50-caliber machine guns, transforming them into deadly low-altitude attackers. With Pappy's modifications and relentless training against derelict ships off Port Moresby, Kenney's men began perfecting the impossible. They flew at 200 feet, releasing bombs with split-second timing. It was reckless, it was dangerous, but it worked. The old rules of aerial warfare were being rewritten in real time. Now Kenney was waiting for the right opportunity. A big enough target, a high-stakes mission. Something worth testing this bold new tactic against. Operation 81 was that opportunity, and the skies above New Guinea were about to become the proving ground for the most radical shift in naval warfare the Pacific had ever seen. By mid-February 1943, all signs pointed to an impending Japanese operation. Reconnaissance photos from Rabaul showed the harbor teeming with activity. Over 70 vessels clustered in tight formation, a suspicious concentration that screamed preparation. Then confirmation came from an even more secretive source. Ultra-intelligence. Allied codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington had intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications, revealing a detailed convoy plan. Departure, February 28th. Destination, Leh. Cargo, 6,900 soldiers from the 51st Division. The pieces were aligning for a massive confrontation. General Kenney wasted no time. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He gathered his commanders and mapped out a coordinated attack, unlike anything the Pacific had seen. It wouldn't be just a bombing raid. It would be a full-force, multi-layered assault involving 219 aircraft, B-17 flying fortresses for high-altitude bombing, B-25 Mitchells modified for low-level skip bombing, A-20 Havocs, and a fleet of P-38 and P-40 fighters to control the skies. But Kenney understood this attack required more than just firepower. It demanded timing, precision, and suppression. That's where the Australians came in. No 30 squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force had been mastering low-level strike tactics with Bristol Beaufighters, twin-engine monsters loaded with 20mm cannons and machine guns. Group Captain Bill Garing proposed a bold plan. The Beaufighters would lead the charge, coming in at mast height to strafe and disable Japanese deck gunners. Then the B-25s would sweep in, unleashing skip bombs at point-blank range. From above, the B-17s would rain bombs to split Japanese defenses. Kenney approved it. The strike was scheduled to unfold over 2 days, catching the convoy in the most vulnerable stretch of its journey. Now it was a waiting game. Back in Rabaul, the Japanese loaded their ships with grim efficiency. 8 transport vessels, each packed with soldiers, equipment, and crucial supplies, prepared for departure. General Adachi, commander of the 18th Army, personally boarded the destroyer Tokitsukaze, while his colleague, General Nakano, boarded the Yukikaze. The concentration of so many senior leaders in one convoy was rare and risky, but it showed just how critical the mission was. The route chosen for the voyage was not the most direct. Learning from past disasters, Rear Admiral Kimura opted for a longer northern arc along New Britain's coast, hoping the island's rugged terrain would shield the convoy from Allied radar and reconnaissance. The riskiest leg, through the narrow Vitiaz Strait, would be saved for last, and ideally passed under the cover of darkness. Japanese Air Command had promised 100 fighters to provide cover along the route, but the truth was less reassuring. The fighters, already worn from constant combat, could only stay airborne for brief rotations. The convoy would be exposed for long stretches, especially as it entered Allied reach near Leh. Still, Kimura pressed forward. The troops had boarded, the mission was underway. On the evening of February 28th, under the cover of tropical dusk, the first ships slipped quietly out of Simpson Harbor. One by one, they formed into 2 columns, flanked protectively by destroyers. At precisely midnight, Kimura gave the order. The convoy moved steadily into the night, unaware that they were sailing into a meticulously laid trap. For nearly 24 hours, fortune favored the Japanese. A pair of passing storms blanketed the sea, hiding the convoy from reconnaissance. Rain pounded the decks, but the cover was welcome. Soldiers, crammed below deck, endured seasickness in silence, praying for landfall. Officers remained alert, knowing their luck couldn't hold forever. They were right. On the afternoon of March 1st, as clouds briefly cleared near Cape Gloucester, a single B-24 from the 91st Bombardment Group, piloted by Lieutenant Walter Higgins, spotted the entire formation from high above. He counted the ships, double-checked, and radioed a contact report back to Port Moresby. The net had closed. The Allies now knew exactly where the convoy was and exactly where it would be. The countdown to devastation had begun. The mood inside 5th Air Force headquarters in Port Moresby changed the moment Higgins' message came through. The sighting was earlier than expected, which posed both an opportunity and a complication. The convoy was still in open water north of the Vitiaz Strait, an area where Japanese fighters could still provide limited protection. General Kenney and Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead huddled over the maps, analyzing timing, routes, and weather. The full-scale skip-bombing assault would wait. For now, they would test the waters. The decision was made: launch a conventional high-altitude strike immediately, using B-17 flying fortresses to harass and slow the convoy. It wasn't meant to destroy, but to weaken, set the stage for the knockout punch the next morning. 28 B-17s, their bomb bays loaded and wings glinting in the afternoon sun, roared into the sky from Port Moresby and Milne Bay. As the sun rose on March 2nd, the Japanese convoy pushed steadily southward. On board the transport Kyokus Maru, soldiers of the 51st Division were crammed shoulder to shoulder, sweating in the stagnant heat below deck. Above, Japanese destroyer commanders scanned the skies nervously. At approximately 10 o'clock a.m., their fears were realized. B-17s appeared high in the sky, flying tight formations at 6,500 feet. Japanese Zero fighters scrambled to intercept, but only managed to harass the edges of the bombing run. As the bombers released their payloads, the sea erupted with geysers of water, some dangerously close. The Kyokus Maru was not so lucky. A direct hit tore through her midsection. She broke in half and began to sink almost immediately. Another transport took glancing damage and began to lag behind. Aboard the destroyer Asashio, Captain Sato Yasuo reacted swiftly. He maneuvered his ship alongside the sinking Kyokus Maru, pulling hundreds of survivors from the oil-soaked sea. Soldiers were packed into every corridor, every open space. It was a noble act, but a costly one. Asashio was now overloaded, less maneuverable, and dangerously vulnerable. Night fell, and with it came a critical choice. Rear Admiral Kimura knew they were still 12 hours from Leh. One ship was gone, and others were crippled. He had two options: push the faster ships ahead and get at least some of the troops to shore, or keep the convoy together, prioritizing protection over speed. Kimura chose unity. All ships would stay in formation, they would face whatever came next together. But his decision, grounded in honor and cohesion, played right into Allied hands. Through decrypted messages, Whitehead and Kenney now knew the convoy's exact speed, location, and formation. It was a gift of precision no military planner could ask for. That night, the airfields buzzed with activity. Mechanics made final checks on bomb fuses and machine gun mounts. Pilots quietly reviewed attack diagrams one last time. Letters home were scribbled in tents under flickering lights, some sealed with trembling hands. Everyone knew what tomorrow would bring. At the wreck of the SS Pruth near Port Moresby, the modified B-25s had trained for this moment, flying in at wave-top height, unleashing bombs with 5-second fuses, pulling up just in time to avoid their own blast. Now, those same aircraft were being loaded for war. In the darkness before dawn on March 3rd, engines rumbled to life. Pilots buckled in, gunners clutched their weapons. The skies over New Guinea were about to become the stage for a bold new tactic that would forever alter the nature of warfare. And the convoy, steady and unaware, steamed ever closer to its doom. March 3rd, 1943, broke with a cruel clarity. The Bismarck Sea lay flat and still beneath a cloudless sky, as if the heavens themselves were waiting. On board the Japanese destroyers and transports, sailors and soldiers moved through their morning routines, scanning the skies, checking equipment, bracing for what they knew might come. Rear Admiral Kimura had ordered strict anti-aircraft discipline, no firing unless commanded. Ammunition was precious, and any panic could be fatal. At 10 o'clock a.m., the first low growl of engines rolled over the horizon, not from above, but from the sea line itself. 13 Bristol Beaufighters of the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 30 Squadron appeared, flying so low that their propellers churned wakes into the water. Their formation was tight, their intent unmistakable. From the bridge of the Arashio, Captain Hideo Kuboki squinted against the morning glare. These weren't bombers. They were attack aircraft, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns each, coming in hard. Before Kuboki could react, the Beaufighters unleashed a storm. Steel and fire tore across the decks. Gunners fell where they stood, ripped apart before they could return fire. The Arashio's superstructure shattered under the barrage. Kuboki's bridge filled with smoke and screams. And then came the B-25s. Modified into flying gunships, the American Mitchell bombers came in behind the Beaufighters, nose guns blazing. Major Ed Lorne leading the charge in his aircraft. Betty's Dream zeroed in on the destroyer Shirayuki. From just 50 feet above the surface, he released his skip bombs, 2 500-pound charges bouncing across the sea like skipping stones. They struck below Shirayuki's waterline and detonated with devastating force. The destroyer's stern lifted, then shattered. Fire erupted from below decks as the ship groaned and began to list. Rear Admiral Kimura was thrown from the bridge and into the sea. He survived, badly wounded, and was rescued by the destroyer Shikinami. His flagship did not survive. All around, chaos blossomed. One by one, the B-25s executed their deadly runs. The transport Teo Maru, packed with over 1,000 soldiers, was struck mid-ship. It buckled, tilted, and then capsized in minutes. Hundreds of troops trapped below never surfaced. Others spilled into the oil-streaked water, dazed and helpless. The Tokitsukaze carrying General Adachi was next. 3 B-25s attacked in unison. The destroyer's captain attempted to shield nearby transports by turning broadside, but the bombs found their mark. The engine room erupted in flame. Adachi, incredibly, survived again and was evacuated. 19 of his crew weren't so lucky. Then came Arashio's turn. Already battered from the earlier strafing, her steering was destroyed by another hit. The crippled destroyer veered uncontrollably and smashed into the side of the Nojima Maru transport. Locked together in a deadly embrace, both ships became sitting targets for the next wave. Smoke, fire, and blood choked the sea. Ships buckled and split. Lifeboats were splintered. Men clung to debris, screaming. The coordinated attack unfolded with terrifying efficiency, a ballet of destruction honed through weeks of training and fueled by vengeance. But the worst was still to come. Above the smoke and gunfire, high-altitude B-17s were lining up their final bombing runs. Below, the last of the bow fighters wheeled around for another pass. And in the distance, a second wave of bombers was forming. The Japanese convoy, once proud and full of hope, was being erased ship by ship, man by man, and the skies were far from empty. By 10:15 a.m., the Pacific was burning. In just 15 minutes, the convoy that Rear Admiral Kimura had sworn to protect had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Of the 8 transports, 7 were now either sunk or sinking. Fires raged across the water's surface, fueled by ruptured fuel tanks and exploding ammunition. Lifeboats had been obliterated in the blasts. Survivors floated in the wreckage, oil blackened and disoriented as shark fins began to circle. The B-25s, having completed their runs, climbed back toward the clouds, engines howling. But their damage was already done. The destroyer Tokitsukaze, drifting with its guts torn open, had been evacuated. General Adachi, his second shipwreck in 24 hours, had been pulled aboard the destroyer Yukikaze, wounded but alive. Around him, the sea swallowed another 100 men. Meanwhile, aboard the transport Kembu Maru, panic took hold. The decks tilted sharply. Soldiers fought to free life rafts and lower them, but many had been destroyed or jammed. Officers shouted, swords drawn, trying to impose order. Their words were drowned by the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire. Men leapt overboard rather than burn alive. Some never resurfaced. On the Asashio, already loaded with hundreds of survivors rescued the day before, Captain Sato Yasuo made a desperate stand. He ordered every available gun to fire, creating a steel wall of flak to protect what little remained. His crew, shoulder to shoulder with the rescued, fought furiously. Then a B-17, nearly forgotten in the chaos above, released its payload. One bomb struck the forward deck dead center. The explosion was devastating. With hundreds of additional men crammed into every corridor, the flooding was instant and fatal. The Asashio rolled sharply and began to sink. Captain Sato remained on the bridge, refusing to abandon his ship. His final words, heard by a surviving officer, were chilling in their calm. "I'm tired. Let me rest." Moments later, he went down with his crew. Around the convoy, the remaining destroyers, Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, circled through the inferno, searching for anyone still alive. But the task was impossible. The sea was filled with floating bodies and burning oil. Explosions still erupted from munitions on board the sinking ships. The clock was ticking. More Allied aircraft would return soon. Back at Port Moresby, the second wave of bombers was already airborne. This time, their mission wasn't to disable, it was to finish. By early afternoon, more B-25s and A-20 Havocs arrived, diving low through the thick smoke. The transport Oigawa Maru, one of the few still afloat, was struck directly amidships. The blast tore her open like paper. Her deck lifted briefly before splitting apart. Survivors screamed from the wreckage, but few could be saved. The remaining destroyers made the grim decision to break off rescue efforts. If they lingered, they too would be destroyed. Screams echoed across the water as the ships turned away, men begging not to be left behind. But the war didn't care for mercy. As dusk settled over the sea, the last fires flickered and dimmed. Of the 6,900 soldiers that had embarked at Rabaul, only about 1,200 would reach Lae. Another 2,700 were rescued and returned to Rabaul. But over 3,000 men, soldiers, sailors, officers, had vanished into the Pacific. And all of it had happened in a single, savage day. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't over yet. But its outcome was already clear. Innovation, precision, and audacity had rewritten the rules. And for the Japanese command, the full weight of that lesson was only beginning to settle. March 4th dawned not with celebration, but with silence. In the wake of one of the most decisive air-sea battles of the Pacific War, the remnants of the Japanese convoy had vanished beneath the waves. The waters still rippled with oil and smoke. Charred life jackets floated beside splintered wood. Bodies drifted in groups, some lifeless, others still clinging to life. And overhead, the Allied planes returned. Not for battle, but to finish the job. American PT boats and aircraft swept over the battlefield, scouring for signs of survivors. Officially, their orders were to prevent any remaining Japanese troops from reaching land and reinforcing Leh. In practice, this meant attacking rafts, debris fields, even men swimming. For some crews, it was duty. For others, it felt like slaughter. One American pilot later wrote, "We saw them in the water, hundreds. No weapons, just arms reaching up. But the order came over the radio, take out anything that floats. I did what I was told, but I never stopped seeing their faces." Back in Rabaul, what little was left of the convoy returned like ghosts. The destroyers that had escaped, Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, limped into port, hulls scorched, decks battered. The men they carried, around 2,700 survivors, were silent. Their uniforms were soaked in salt and blood. Many were wounded, some delirious. All were changed. General Adachi, rescued twice in 2 days, stepped onto the dock with just a fraction of the force he had embarked with. Of the nearly 7,000 troops sent to Leh, fewer than 1,200 had made it. His message to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo was brief and damning. The situation is beyond recovery by normal means. Tokyo's response was swift but subdued. There would be no public mourning, no national broadcast. The losses were too staggering. Propaganda outlets claimed that most troops had reached Leh successfully and dismissed Allied reports as fabrications. But the truth echoed through the ranks. The convoy had been annihilated. The Allies now controlled the sea lanes. For the men who had fought, there was no need for reports. The images haunted them. Captain Tamechi Hara of the destroyer Amatsukaze, who had not participated in the battle but later interviewed survivors, described the stories he heard as ghastly. One soldier from the 51st Division told of clinging to a floating barrel with 11 other men. After 3 days, only 3 remained. The rest were claimed by sharks, drowning, or madness. Rear Admiral Kimura, wounded and stripped of his command, returned to a desk job in Japan. No blame was assigned to him. The High Command recognized he had done everything he could, but something inside him had broken. He never commanded in battle again. Meanwhile, among the Allied forces, news of the victory spread like wildfire. General Douglas MacArthur issued a triumphant communiqué claiming the destruction of 22 ships and 15,000 Japanese troops, a dramatic exaggeration, but a potent morale boost. For the Australians who had played a key role in the initial attack, it was validation. They had fought hard, flown low, and proved that their air force was equal to any in the world. Still, behind the accolades lay unease. Many Allied pilots, especially those who had seen the floating bodies and burning men, carried a weight that wouldn't lift. Lieutenant Charles Howe of the 3rd Attack Group wrote to his wife, "It was necessary, I know, but I can't forget the sight of all those men in the water. This isn't the kind of war I thought I'd be fighting." The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had achieved more than military success. It had shattered illusions. The ocean was no longer a shield for ships. The air now ruled, and as both sides regrouped, the true impact of that revelation had only begun to unfold. In the days that followed, the strategic consequences of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea echoed across the Pacific like a thunderclap. For Japan, the disaster exposed a sobering reality. Their long-standing reliance on surface convoys to reinforce and resupply distant outposts had become untenable. The once confident Imperial Navy had been humiliated by land-based aircraft, an outcome few had believed possible just months before. Admiral Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the combined fleet, recorded the bitter truth in his diary. "We have lost the ability to move freely within range of enemy land-based aircraft." Imperial headquarters issued a new directive by March 25th. Large-scale daylight convoys would cease. From now on, only small detachments, supplies and troops moved by fast destroyers or submarines under cover of darkness would be permitted. These were dubbed rat runs, a far cry from the proud fleet movements of early war. Japan had not just lost a battle, it had lost a strategy. For the Allies, the victory was more than tactical. It was a proof of concept. General Kenney's radical ideas, skip bombing, low-level attack coordination, forward-firing gunships, had delivered results beyond expectations. B-25s with modified nose guns, previously dismissed as experimental oddities, were now validated as indispensable. North American Aviation, the B-25's manufacturer, began building new models with forward-facing guns integrated into the design. What had begun as Pappy Gunn's improvised project was now official doctrine. Kenney's team wasted no time. Lessons from the Bismarck Sea were integrated into training protocols across the theater. Skip bombing became a standard technique, taught to new crews arriving from the States. Allied air groups began refining the timing, spacing, and altitude of their attacks. By mid-1943, Japanese shipping across the Pacific was in retreat, not because of battleships, but because of bombers. The psychological shift was just as profound. American and Australian airmen, once skeptical of their own effectiveness, now believed. And belief in war is a weapon of its own. But the legacy was not without its shadows. Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, the man whose creativity had sparked the revolution, remained driven by more than strategy. His family, wife and children, were still interned in a Japanese prison camp in Manila. Every ship sunk brought him closer, he hoped, to their liberation. But victory could not erase the personal cost. He became more withdrawn after the battle, haunted not by doubt but by urgency. His war wasn't over until his family was free. In the broader theater, General MacArthur seized on the victory to push his strategic vision. The stunning effectiveness of air power at Bismarck Sea convinced skeptics in Washington and Canberra that his island-hopping strategy, leapfrogging fortified Japanese positions and striking at their logistics, was not only viable but necessary. Resources flowed into the Southwest Pacific. What had once been a secondary theater was now central to the Allied advance. In Lae, the few Japanese troops who did arrive, just over 1,000 men, found themselves without backup, surrounded by jungle, illness, and an enemy that now owned the skies. Their fate was sealed the moment the last transport went under. The waters of the Bismarck Sea calmed in the following days. The smoke cleared, but beneath the surface lay twisted steel, silent wreckage, and the remains of thousands of men whose stories had ended in fire and salt. For the Allies, it was a turning point. For Japan, it was the beginning of isolation, and for the world, it was the moment when air power officially replaced the battleship as the dominant force of naval warfare. As weeks passed, the physical wreckage of the battle began to fade beneath the waves, but its psychological and cultural aftershocks endured. In Tokyo, the official story told by Japanese state media painted a different picture, a successful delivery of reinforcements to Lae with minimal losses. But soldiers and sailors knew the truth. Survivors returning to Japan whispered the real story in quiet bars and crowded train stations. They spoke of flames that fell from the sky, of ships torn in two, of comrades screaming in the water as they sank beneath the Pacific. For many, silence was easier than retelling what they had seen. Families of the lost received carefully worded notices. Your husband died gloriously for the emperor. That was all. No detail, no context. For mothers and wives, grief arrived in the form of emptiness. They would never know that their sons had died not on a battlefield, but clinging to burning debris, praying for a rescue that never came. In contrast, the Allied press turned the Battle of the Bismarck Sea into a moment of triumph. Newspapers in New York and Melbourne ran headlines celebrating the annihilation of a Japanese invasion force. Photographs of smiling pilots and grinning ground crews circulated with captions like, "Death from the sky." The moral clarity of war, us versus them, made it easy to overlook the human tragedy beneath the tactical brilliance. But some of the men who flew those missions couldn't forget. Lieutenant Charles Howe, one of the B-25 pilots, wrote in his journal, "They didn't have a chance. We hit them like a hammer. I know it saved lives, maybe even ended the war sooner, but it felt like we were shooting drowning men." For him and many others, victory came laced with guilt. Australian airmen shared that sentiment. The Beaufighter crews of No. 30 Squadron had led the initial strike, their cannons tearing apart ships and flesh alike. Squadron leader Claude Ridley later reflected, "It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Necessary, yes, but there was no glory in it. Still, the tactical and strategic implications were undeniable. Military theorists across the world pored over the battle's details. In the United States, war colleges began teaching Bismarck Sea as a case study in joint operations and effects-based warfare. Intelligence, air power, and coordination had come together to destroy a powerful force before it could even land. And for the Japanese High Command, the recriminations began. The Army blamed the Navy for inadequate air cover. The Navy blamed the Army for insisting on daylight operations. Behind closed doors, bitter arguments erupted. The old rivalry between branches, one that had long plagued Japan's war planning, now spilled into open resentment. No real changes were made. No unified countermeasure was adopted. While the Allies innovated, the Japanese command fractured. Meanwhile, on the ground in Leh, the reality was stark. The reinforcements that had been promised, nearly 7,000 men, had arrived as a trickle of barely 1,200. No heavy equipment, no supplies, morale plummeted. The few who had survived the voyage found themselves surrounded by thick jungle, battling disease and starvation as much as Allied patrols. The hope that the 51st Division would stabilize New Guinea died before it ever touched the shore. And beneath the calm waters of the Bismarck Sea, the graveyard grew quiet, silent, forgotten by some, but remembered forever by those who had lived it. The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning to shape the rest of the war. In the months that followed, the legacy of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea spread far beyond the waters where it had been fought. Its effects rippled through doctrine, innovation, and the psyche of those who had survived it. In the United States and Australia, military planners embraced the lessons with urgency. The concept of skip bombing, once a fringe idea, was now mainstream. Aircrews trained with renewed purpose, perfecting low-level approaches, adjusting fuses, calculating release points with mathematical precision. New weapons were developed. Rocket pods and heavier ordnance were tested against ship hulks off remote coastlines. The future was airborne, and everyone knew it. At North American Aviation, engineers began incorporating Pappy guns modifications into the very design of B-25s. Forward-facing 50-caliber machine guns became standard. The bomber was no longer just a tool for high-altitude bombardment. It had evolved into a strike platform capable of precision assault. The line between fighter and bomber blurred. Innovation had triumphed over tradition. But for the Japanese, the path forward was murkier. The once vaunted Imperial Navy had been dealt a blow it couldn't explain away. Publicly, the leadership projected confidence. Internally, morale faltered. Supply lines to outposts like Leh, Salamaua, and later Wewak were now lifelines of desperation. Submarines and small destroyers took over supply duties, creeping through the night in what became known as the Tokyo Rat Runs. Those missions were treacherous. Ships ran dark, navigating by starlight, hugging coastlines, dodging reefs. Any encounter with Allied aircraft meant almost certain death. Many Japanese sailors sent on those missions didn't expect to return, and often they didn't. As the Allies advanced up the New Guinea coast, they did so with increasing confidence. The destruction of the convoy had unshackled MacArthur's forces from the fear of being outflanked or overwhelmed. With control of the sea and the air, Allied forces moved faster, more decisively. Island after island fell, not just from battle, but from starvation and abandonment, as Japan could no longer resupply its garrisons. For survivors of the battle, the scars were deep. Japanese soldiers who had clung to rafts for days, watching sharks circle, feeling the sun cook their skin, were changed men. Many never spoke of it again. One survivor, interviewed decades later, recalled, "We were not soldiers in that moment. We were just men trying not to die. There was no honor, only fear." On the Allied side, the victory didn't come without a price. Pilots who had returned home heroes struggled with what they had done. Some woke at night, haunted by the faces they saw in the water. Others drank too much, spoke too little, and aged faster than their years. War had brought out their courage, but also their grief. Even the seas themselves bore witness. Oil slicks stained coral reefs for miles. Wreckage, twisted steel, fuel drums, and the occasional helmet washed ashore for weeks. In the years to come, divers would explore those wrecks, finding gun turrets still pointed at the sky, tables still set in mess halls, and skeletons entombed in rusting holds. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a symbol, a warning, and it marked the beginning of the end for Japanese dominance in the Southwest Pacific. As 1943 wore on, the wreckage beneath the Bismarck Sea remained a grim monument to a new era of warfare, an era where air power reigned and surface ships sailed under its shadow. Military historians and strategists across the Allied nations began to dissect the battle in detail. At war colleges in the United States and Britain, the Bismarck Sea was presented as a model for effects-based operations, a showcase of how precise, coordinated force could achieve massive strategic gain with limited resources. It wasn't about overwhelming firepower. It was about planning, innovation, and timing. The Japanese, too, studied the battle, but their analysis was less about innovation and more about loss. The bitter rivalry between the Imperial Army and Navy reignited. Army commanders accused the Navy of failing to provide adequate air cover. Navy officials retorted that the Army's insistence on broad daylight movements had been suicidal. But as fingers pointed, no new tactics emerged. Japan's military command, increasingly strained by defeats, failed to adapt to the realities laid bare by the battle. On the ground, in the dense jungles of New Guinea, the consequences of the battle became even more apparent. The garrisons in Leh and Salamaua, already isolated, began to wither. Without reinforcements or supplies, Japanese soldiers fought on with dwindling rations, scavenging from the jungle, suffering from disease, and falling one by one. The 51st Division, meant to rejuvenate Japan's hold on the island, had arrived as little more than a ghost of its intended strength. For General Adachi, the defeat at sea meant an unwinnable land war. He adapted as best he could, digging in, setting traps, and harassing Allied supply lines. But he knew, as did his troops, that they were on borrowed time. Without resupply or reinforcement, even the fiercest defense would eventually collapse. Back at Allied command, General Kenny's reputation soared. The success at Bismarck Sea elevated his status and validated his belief in flexible, forward-thinking air strategy. He continued to push for more innovation, more investment in low-altitude bombing, and more inter-service coordination. In his memoirs years later, he would write, "That battle proved what I had long believed. Air power wasn't just support. It could be decisive." The airmen under his command, though celebrated, bore the weight of their role. Some returned home to ticker-tape parades. Others found solace only in silence. A pilot who had flown in the first wave of skip bombers later confessed to his chaplain, "We didn't fight a battle, we wiped them out." I can't stop hearing them scream. Australian pilots, often overshadowed by their American counterparts, were recognized within their own ranks as essential to the operation's success. The Beaufighter squadrons, flying just feet above the waves, had neutralized Japanese anti-aircraft defenses and cleared the path for the B-25s. Squadron leader Claude Ridley received the Distinguished Flying Cross, but he refused to give interviews, saying only, "What we did was necessary, but don't ask me to relive it." For both sides, the battle marked a transition, a brutal awakening to the speed with which warfare could evolve. Those who had clung to old doctrines paid the price. Those willing to innovate, to risk everything on untested tactics, reaped the rewards. But no reward could undo what had been lost. The Bismarck Sea, once a quiet corridor of ocean between islands, had become a graveyard. And beneath its surface, history was being written in rusted hulls and broken dreams. By the summer of 1943, the momentum of the Pacific War had shifted decisively. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't the sole reason, but it was the pivotal one. It served as both a military turning point and a psychological blow from which the Japanese command would never fully recover. And while Allied leaders like MacArthur and Kenney celebrated the operational triumph, those closer to the wreckage lived with its darker truths. In a quiet hospital tent near Port Moresby, Corporal James Rowley of the 5th Air Force recovered from injuries sustained in a crash landing days after the battle. Nurses reported that he often stared into space, mumbling names. His co-pilot had died during their final approach after a successful bombing run. Rowley blamed himself. "We made it back," he whispered, "but he didn't. We all came back different. Stories like his were common. Medics noted rising cases of combat fatigue. Some pilots refused to fly again. Others developed rituals before missions. Silent prayers, notes to family, tokens of those they'd lost. The glamour once associated with being a pilot dulled under the weight of what they had witnessed. Yet the war machine moved forward. The United States ramped up production of modified B-25s, with entire squadrons now equipped for low-level strafing and skip bombing. Training films recreated the tactics used at Bismarck, using diagrams, voice-over narration, and carefully edited footage. Recruits watched in darkened rooms, wide-eyed, absorbing the new gospel of precision strike warfare. Meanwhile, Japanese planners scrambled to adapt. Some advocated for investing in improved anti-aircraft defenses or deploying more fighters for air cover. But resources were already stretched thin. The battles in the Solomon Islands, the defense of the Philippines, and the pressure mounting in Burma all competed for the same dwindling supply lines. In truth, the Japanese empire was overextended, and nowhere was that more obvious than in New Guinea. For the people of the region, the battle left its own mark. Indigenous villagers near the Huon Gulf had witnessed the sky fill with thunder and the ocean turn black with fire. They watched from ridges as ships burned and men died. In the weeks that followed, many helped retrieve survivors, Japanese and Allied, pulling men from the surf, offering food or shelter. Others buried bodies that washed ashore, honoring the dead in the only way they could. These acts rarely made it into official records. But among those rescued, they were never forgotten. Years later, an Australian pilot returned to a small village outside Finschhafen, hoping to thank the family that had sheltered him after his aircraft ditched into the sea. He found only their grandchildren. The elder who had hidden him had passed, but the family remembered the story. They welcomed him, fed him, and showed him the rusted dog tags their grandfather had kept all those years. The war had forged unlikely bonds in the most violent of ways. As 1943 bled into 1944, the Japanese stronghold in Leh finally fell. The remnants of the 51st Division, those who had survived the Bismarck disaster and months of jungle warfare, were either captured, killed, or pushed back into the interior. Few made it home. Fewer still were heard from again, and so the Bismarck Sea faded from headlines. But for those who had flown through its smoke, fought through its flames, or floated in its oil-slicked waters, it was never far away. It lived in their memories, in their dreams, and in the silence that followed, it waited to be remembered. As the war pressed on, the significance of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea became clearer, not just as a tactical victory, but as a symbol of transformation. For America and her allies, it marked the beginning of a more aggressive, mobile, and coordinated form of warfare. No longer tied to the old traditions of battleship supremacy, the Pacific Theater now belonged to airmen, to engineers, to those who could innovate faster than the enemy could react. In Washington, military planners cited Bismarck Sea as a justification for the continued expansion of air forces. Resources were diverted from heavy cruisers and redirected to long-range bombers, fighters, and carriers. The battle was featured in official reports, studied by strategists, and used in recruitment films designed to inspire the next wave of pilots and gunners. It became both lesson and legend. General Kenney, now widely respected, continued to champion air-centric strategy. In briefings with MacArthur and senior Allied leadership, he argued that what had worked at Bismarck could be repeated again and again across the Pacific. Each island leap would follow the same pattern: isolate, strike from the air, then land with ground forces only when necessary. The costly frontal assaults of the early war years were being replaced with precision. But for the veterans who had lived it, the transformation came with a price. Captain Harold Bishop, whose squadron had flown 6 missions during the Bismarck offensive, returned to the States in early 1944. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and spoke at war bond rallies across the Midwest. But his speeches were short, clipped. He rarely spoke of the battle itself. Offstage, he drank quietly and kept a folded photograph of his lost wingman in his wallet. "They want to hear about victory," he told a friend, "not what it cost." In post-war Japan, the battle became a subject of quiet study. Former officers, those who had survived the war, examined the failure in private forums. They spoke of arrogance, of underestimating Allied capability, and of the dangerous belief that traditional naval tactics could survive the new age of warfare. For some, Bismarck Sea became a bitter metaphor, a grand empire, bold and proud, undone by its refusal to change. Wreck divers, years later, would find evidence of that arrogance resting quietly on the sea floor. Ships with ceremonial banners still in storage, ammunition left unfired, engines frozen in their last desperate maneuver. Each wreck told a story, not just of defeat, but of disbelief. As if no one on board truly thought they could be beaten so completely. Back in New Guinea, the locals continued to live among the relics of war. Children found shell casings and broken helmets buried in the earth. Rusted fuel drums served as wash basins. The jungle slowly reclaimed the remnants, but it never fully erased them. The land remembered. By the war's end in 1945, the victory at Bismarck Sea had been absorbed into the broader narrative of Allied success. It wasn't as famous as Midway or as dramatic as Iwo Jima, but within military circles it was respected. Studied not for the scale of destruction, but for the precision with which it had been carried out, and for the men who flew through clouds of flak and fire, who saw ships break apart beneath them, and who returned with silence in their hearts. It remained personal, because the Bismarck Sea was not just a battle, it was a moment when everything changed. In the final year of the war, as Allied forces closed in on Japan's home islands, the lessons of the Bismarck Sea continued to echo across command rooms, flight decks, and airfields scattered across the Pacific. Tactics born in desperation had matured into doctrine. Skip bombing, once considered reckless, was now taught to every new bomber crew. Low-level strafing runs, once improvised, were refined into exacting maneuvers practiced daily. Forward-firing bombers, an innovation that had emerged from battlefield necessity, were now standard across multiple air forces. And at the heart of it all was a quiet acknowledgement. What had happened in that stretch of ocean near New Guinea had rewritten the playbook. General Kenney, reflecting on the war's final campaigns, often cited the Bismarck Sea as the moment when air power stopped being support and started being strategy. "We didn't just destroy ships," he said once in an after-action briefing, "we broke their will. We proved we could choke an army without ever landing a division." The Japanese, facing mounting defeats and a shrinking empire, shifted to defensive desperation. Their convoys, once symbols of reach and strength, became elusive targets creeping through the night. But the skies belonged to the Allies now, and there was nowhere left to hide. Every supply line was vulnerable. Every ship was a potential target. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese commanders grew wary of deploying reinforcements by sea. Strategic decisions were delayed. Some garrisons were ordered to hold without support, to die where they stood. The loss at Bismarck Sea had taught Japan that movement meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Meanwhile, in America, the battle entered textbooks and training manuals. It was dissected at the Army Air Force's School of Applied Tactics and studied by cadets who would go on to fight in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. It became a foundational case study in the evolution of joint force operations and the integration of air and sea strategy. But outside the halls of command and history, memories of the battle lived on in more personal ways. In a nursing home in Ohio, an elderly veteran named Edward Vaughan kept a hand-drawn map of the Bismarck Sea on his nightstand. He had flown cover for the Beaufighters during the attack. When asked about the battle, he would only say, "We flew in low, we didn't look back." His granddaughter later said he spoke more often about the sound of the ocean after the attack than of the victory itself. In Japan, a former sailor who survived the convoy would walk the shoreline every morning, staring east. He never remarried, never joined veterans' associations. When pressed, he would say only, "We thought we were the empire," but the ocean had other plans. Even the sea itself, that vast, restless body, bore quiet witness. Wreckage occasionally surfaced, fragments of steel, shattered radios, bones. Local fishermen would bring them ashore, place them in makeshift shrines. Not out of loyalty, but out of reverence. War had touched their waters, and they remembered. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not the largest, nor the bloodiest, nor the most famous, but it was one of the most defining. A clash of old-world confidence and new-world innovation, of rigid doctrine against fluid thinking, of empire against evolution. And as the war neared its terrible conclusion, that battle remained a stark reminder. The tide does not turn on size alone. It turns on strategy, courage, and the willingness to change. Long after the guns fell silent and the treaties were signed, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea lingered, not in the headlines, but in memory. It lingered in the stories whispered at kitchen tables, in letters kept folded inside drawers, in photographs fading beneath glass frames. Veterans spoke of it rarely, and when they did, it was with a tone that blended pride with pain. Because for all the strategic brilliance, for all the innovation and success, the human cost was undeniable. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died in the space of just a few days. Men who had families, who had dreams, who boarded their ships believing in duty and honor, only to vanish beneath a storm of steel and fire. Most left no trace, no grave, no goodbye. For the Allied airmen, many returned home to celebrations, parades, and medals. But some carried a different burden, one that medals could not ease. They had seen the faces of their enemies, not as faceless villains, but as desperate men trying to survive. And that recognition haunted them. Lieutenant Frank Cooper, one of the youngest B-25 pilots in the battle, later wrote in his journal, "We were told they were evil, but in the water, as they screamed and clung to debris, they just looked human." He never flew again after the war. He became a schoolteacher, and every March he lit a candle at sunrise. The battle became a lesson, not just in tactics, but in humanity. It showed what could be achieved with courage, intelligence, and coordination. But it also showed the cost of war when nations refuse to change, when pride outweighs wisdom, when strategy becomes stagnation. In the Pacific, rusted hulls still rest beneath the waves. Some have become artificial reefs, teeming with fish and coral. Nature reclaims what war tries to destroy. But divers who descend into those silent graveyards often come back changed. Because the silence down there isn't just deep, it's eternal. Each wreck, each relic, is a reminder that beneath every headline of victory lies a story of sacrifice, that behind every tactical success are lives forever altered, and that progress, true progress, should never come at the cost of forgetting. Today, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is taught in military academies, remembered in ceremonies, and honored by the few who remain. But its greatest legacy is not found in the textbooks or medals. It's found in the humility it leaves behind. Because war may test the strength of nations, but it reveals the soul of those who fight. And in that, the Bismarck Sea remains a mirror, one we still look into. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on the cost of war and the courage of those who lived it, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your reflections, especially if your family was touched by the events of World War II. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.